Pleasure to meet you, and my apologies for having to postpone the.
Well, no problem. You explained the reason. So you had some surgery done on your Achilles, I suppose.
That's right. That's right. So I need to have my legs up.
Yeah.
It's not ideal, but I hope you can see me well enough.
That must be a major setback for a hiker like you.
It is. It is indeed. Yeah. Absolutely. It's going to last for a few months, and
a few months, and you can't walk during that time.
I can't. Well, I cannot climb or cannot do a real trek, which I normally do.
Which is what you like to do, of course.
Well, that's my business model. I take my clients outside because I think that being in nature favors better decision making.
Yeah. I know about your book, 10 Good Reasons to Go for a Walk.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, you've done your homework very well.
Yeah. So, and you talk about making better decisions when exercising outside. So, well, maybe we can get to that later on. But first, allow me to introduce myself to you. My name is Tijmen Sprakel. You pronounce it as Tijmen. Tijmen, yes.
Tijmen, right.
And I'm a teacher of English and music on a secondary school in close to Rotterdam, a city you know for sure. And I've been teaching for over 13 years. And apart from teaching, I also write about science and classroom management, or science and classroom practice. And I'm always on the lookout for best practices and sciences and research that can improve education. And when I stumbled upon your book, which you co-wrote with none other than Klaus Schab, The Great Reset, I have a printed version, but you get the idea. I realized that it could have implications, or should have implications, for education as well. And I'm sure, and I know, and I've experienced that this COVID-19 crisis has had its impact on education. So what I would like to talk about today is the implications of the Great Reset and COVID-19 on education, and how we can turn this pandemic in our favor, I guess. So I would like to divide our talk into three parts. The first part is defining the Great Reset, talk about the content of your book and define certain terms. The second part is its effects on education. What should education do with these insights? And lastly, last but not least, conspiracies and myths, because I know it's covered in conspiracies and myths. And since you are the writer of this book, I couldn't think of a better person to talk about these conspiracies and myths concerning this topic. So three parts. So before we start,
how long are we going to speak?
Normally, my interviews last about an hour.
Okay.
So let's see, we can compact everything within an hour. So you like to walk, but I would like to know a bit more about you. Can I call you by your first name, by the way, Thierry?
Of course, by all means. Of course.
And do I pronounce your last name as Malleret?
Yes, Malleret. Yeah.
All right, good. I had 6 years of French in high school, so I still remember. I still remember a bit. I saw your interviews in French on your book, the 10 Good Reasons to Go for Hiking. So I understand a lot of French, but speaking, well, it's been a while. So if you look back on your own school career, on your own education, what are your earliest and fondest memories when we talk about your education?
Well, I have many good memories about education. The biggest one was for me that my education took place in a language that was not my native language. Because when I was 6, I went to Italy with my parents, and I was catapulted in an Italian school which was amazing, fantastic. So I learned everything, a language, new friends, a new cultural environment, and I found it incredibly stimulating. And I was young, but I was already able to discern the differences in terms of educational systems between France and Italy. I'm going to stop my my email, sorry. So my memory about education is this all-encompassing discovery about being educated in a system that was not mine, and which I found incredibly inspiring, fruitful, fun, meaningful.
What is the best aspect of Italian education? What do you like most about it?
Well, it's hard to tell because you cannot dissociate the different elements that are part of it. But you know, it goes back to it was in, I think, 68, many years ago. I remember that it was less formal than in France. There was a very strong social bond in the school, and I was discovering a new culture, new people, new language, and this is what education is all about. It's a process of discovery, and I find it incredibly stimulating to do so in a language that was not mine, because I was discovering a new system plus new language.
And after high school and primary school, you went to study. And you have a background in economics. Can you tell me a bit more about that? Where did you go after secondary school?
I went to university. I went to French university, and then I completed my postgrad degree at Oxford University. And I studied economics and anthropology, social anthropology. I have a twin degree, and I always had a fascination for social sciences. And I decided to major in economics for all sorts of reasons, but I had this proclivity towards social science, and it made me realize that you cannot be properly educated if you are educated within a silo, which is very much the case. You know, if you're particularly in higher education, you're in your own silo. You are at the bottom of a well, and you see a little sliver of sky, and you know everything about a very small thing. And doing social sciences, anthropology, a bit of linguistics, etc., gave me a sense that the world is much broader than that, and you have to confront different points of view, different methodologies, different approaches, and that's an incredibly rich source of insights and understanding about the world.
Yeah, well, you're touching on a problem I think we're seeing during this pandemic, the silo thinking. You see lots of experts in healthcare, in economics, in social sciences that are operating in their silo. I think if you want to solve a crisis like this, it's important that you look beyond those silos. And I think it's a topic you also address in the book. This systemic.
Yes, well, you're right. I mean, silos do not derive from the pandemics. Of course, we had educational silos for decades, but the pandemic made it very clear that we sing along the lines of our own field of expertise, which are ordered in silos by necessity. And that's what we try to address in the book, The Great Reset, to think about the effects and the consequences of the pandemic from a multiplicity of perspectives. And if you're an economist, you think about economic effects. If you are a specialist in environmental sciences, you will think about what it means for climate policies, for example, etc. But in reality, and it's a strong argument we put forward in the book, if you want to think properly about the world of tomorrow, you need to look across different disciplines because they all conflate with each other. So we adopted a very simple methodology, which consists in describing the world according to 5 big macro categories that are all-encompassing: economics, geopolitics, societal issues, the environment, and tech. And that's our premise, that's our starting point. And we hope that by looking at these 5 and the way in which they interact with each other, they conflict with each other, they exacerbate each other's effect, you get a pretty good understanding of what might happen in the world of tomorrow.
Yeah. Well, you also wrote a follow-up, which is called The Great Narrative. But the reason I'd like to talk about The Great Reset is because it's so shrouded in mystery and in conspiracy. So that's the reason I'm not talking about The Great Narrative, which is a follow-up, but I'm talking about The Great Reset, just to make things clear for my readers and followers. So one day your phone rings and Klaus Schwab is calling you, and you two are discussing that you were both thinking of writing a book. So what happened when he called you and proposed, or maybe you did, to co-write a book?
Well, it's something incredibly simple. Klaus Schab called me and said, I had this idea of writing such a book. And I said, well, I had the same idea. So we decided to join efforts and to write a book together. I had worked at the forum in the past, where I had been in charge of the Davos gathering for a few years in the early 2000s. Mm-hmm. I have great respect for Klaus Schwab, and I thought it was a wonderful idea. So we decided to write it together, which we did.
So what did the process look like? Because when reading a book, it's of course hard to discern who's talking. Is it always one voice, or do you think certain chapters expose your ideas more than his? How did the
process... I've written about 50 books in total, including novels.
I know.
And all of them are written à quatre mains, as we say in French, with a co-author. Even the novels. It's very hard to write a novel with someone else because the novel, has a very specific style of writing. So in the end, the person has to take charge, to be in charge for writing everything, rewriting everything. But the process of coming up with the book is a combination of the two people's contributions to the book. And that's how we did it for the book with Klaus Schwab. We discussed ideas every day. We exchange our chapters, our thoughts, our pages, enriching them with the others, with the other person's contribution. And that's how you come up with a book, which is written by yourself and another author. And I think it's a great way to do it because it seems so obvious and so try to say so, but when you are two people, you think better because you submit your production to the constructive criticism of the other person all the time, and vice versa, and you come up with more ideas.
And did you go for walks as well? Because when you walk, you think more clearly and make better decisions.
Absolutely, I wrote it while walking. I have my phone and talk to my phone. And so most of the book, I wrote it while walking. Or skiing, I was skiing at that time. I started it in February 2020. Yeah, no, March 2020. I do a lot of ski touring, which is an extremely meditative form of skiing because when you go on your way up, it's incredibly calm and beautiful and quiet.
Well, you actually walk up a mountain and then you go skiing.
You ski up with skins up the mountain.
So you don't you don't use elevators?
No, you don't. No, which is part of the fun and why it's such a wonderful activity.
Great. So before we dive into the book, the title is really controversial. Why did you choose COVID-19, The Great Reset? I'm sure you had more titles in mind.
No, we didn't. I thought I think the idea of the title comes from me, but I'm not sure. Can't remember now. But no, you have an idea, and immediately you put a name on the idea. And because I knew a bit about the history of pandemics, about the effect that the large pandemics had in the past, on our continent, the Black Plague, etc., in Europe in the previous centuries, and every time you realize that it was a reset for something major. Mm-hmm. motion forces that were beyond the control of policymakers at the time, economic forces, societal forces, many others. So this idea of a reset popped up, and ideas are combinatorial. You know, you think that you come up with a great idea, but in fact, all good ideas are second-hand ideas. And I might have been influenced by the fact that I had read another book called, there are many books containing the word reset, and the word reset is very often used in industries by computer scientists. Of course, we all know how to reset a computer. So I think the idea was the idea of the title was quite banal, but very precise, with a very strong evocative power. So it was a no-brainer.
Yeah,
you know, we could have put in the pandemic, the COVID-19 and its effects, and COVID-19 and what it means, but the Great Reset, I thought, was an apt title, because that's exactly what it is. You know, it's been a great reset, and it's an ongoing great reset, which is going to unfold over many years and probably decades.
Let's talk about the Great Reset. And as you explained, you cover certain areas, 5 main areas: the economic reset, societal reset, geopolitical reset, environmental reset, and technological reset. And a few topics I'd like to address, like surveillance, which is an issue with lots of people. And well, let's start from the beginning, and I will pose some questions about these several chapters. Economic reset. When you wrote the book, there was no Russia invading Ukraine. So many things have happened on the world stage since you first started writing this book. So I can imagine when you write a chapter on economic reset that you have to rewrite the whole chapter because the world stage has changed so much.
Well, if I may, Russia had already invaded Ukraine in 2014.
Yeah, you're right. In Crimea, yeah,
and part of Donbass. Well, the argument that we put forward in many parts of the book is that COVID has accelerating pre-existing trends. There were many. Most trends we look at in the book have been exacerbated and propelled by COVID. You mentioned the world surveillance. You know, the surveillance economy was already a very major issue prior to the pandemic. There were many books written about this issue, Zuboff and many others, and then suddenly COVID provides an opportunity to expand these surveillance systems because of the COVID pass we have on our mobile phones and all sorts of technologies that were put into place at that time. Similarly, you talked about Ukraine, the geopolitical dismemberance that has been happening over the past years is not a new phenomenon. You know, it's the end of unilateralism. It's the explosion of multilateralism. It's the fact that there is not one single power in charge anymore. It has to do with the fact that we have a global governance vacuum, that no one is in charge. And again, it's a trend that was very apparent before COVID and that was made worse by the pandemic. And that's the function of the pandemics throughout history. They exacerbate existing trends and they tend to accelerate the course of history in specific domains. Not that we got everything right in the book, of course. There are many predictions that we make in the book that haven't proven right.
Yeah.
Maybe they will.
So if you have to summarize the economic reset, what are the main bullet points, the main things we should know about the economic reset?
Well, the economic reset, something that we completely failed to anticipate in the book, and which is very much at the core of policy making at the moment, is inflation. And inflation stems maybe partly from the policies, from the supporting fiscal policies put into place during the pandemic, particularly in the US. There are many arguments, counter-arguments as to why this might have contributed to inflation. But here we are. There is a spurge of inflation around the world at the moment. It's a global phenomenon, which has been accelerated by what you just talked about, which is a war in Ukraine, which has made it incredibly worse through effects linked to commodity price inflation, food price inflation, and energy price inflation. So this we didn't predict in the book. It's happening. It's a major policy issue in economics that's happening at the moment. What we did talk about a lot in the book was the effect on inequalities, which I think was right. It's a great concern of yours. And in the book, we make the prediction that there'll be a redistribution of income from capital to labor, because there is a need to revisit the terms of our social contract, which doesn't work anymore anywhere. It's the same phenomenon all over the world. The social contract seems to be broken. And in the book, we argue that there is this major redistribution in terms of income and wealth. It hasn't happened yet, particularly in your sector. There are two sectors in which we thought it would happen faster. Was health and education. It hasn't happened yet, and maybe it will happen in a very chaotic manner. When there is so much inequality around, and when there are so many imbalances in the system. Normally, the adjusting mechanism is revolutions or wars, and we have signs of this at the moment. There is no revolution, no war, but the fact that populism is gaining ground in so many countries around the world, in the US, in Peru, in India, in not most, but in so many countries around the world, were in France during the last election, which came as a complete surprise, the last parliamentary election of last week, is a signal that we may be approaching this turning point, and that redistribution will take place in a very chaotic and possibly revolutionary manner through social turmoil. In
your book, you also refer to a time when the richest of all people paid an income tax above 90%. You said at the end of World War II, many other countries adopted similar and often extreme tax measures. In the UK during the war, the top income tax rose to an extraordinary, stunning 99.25%. Wow, how
amazing!
That, but nowadays we have people owning $200 billion. You can't tell me that those people have paid 99.25% of income tax. It has evaporated. It's gone. It's gone. So don't you think when we impose these kinds of, well, maybe not these kinds, but let's say 50% for the richest in the world, that would solve a lot of issues, don't you think?
Well, 50%. I don't want to venture into the territory of saying, which income tax rate is a right one. But certainly, having more tax justice and because pays taxes properly is an absolute prerequisite for bringing this dissatisfaction, this feeling of resentment, of injustice, of frustration to an end. And you are absolutely right. It's important that companies and individuals who are in a position to do so
But
in a just and fair manner.
Because over the years, obviously, the 99% tariff has disappeared. Something.
Well, yeah, well, 99, everybody understands that this is too much.
Yeah, of course. But,
so how much is enough? We have at the moment this tax global agreement, which tries to impose a not a very high tax rate globally on all companies, which is 15%. It's not a given that it will be approved everywhere in the world.
Yeah.
So the big stumbling block. And you can see how difficult it is to put into place a good, fair, redistributive tax system because there's so many entrenched interests. And that's the problem today with the world economy. In many respects, in many countries around the world, including in the US, it's an oligarchic economy which lives on rents, economic rents, and it's not a viable system because it creates too much inequality, first of all, and a sense of very deep unfairness, which is the root cause of so much dissatisfaction around the world, and the fact that you have populist regimes popping up everywhere.
So you also address minimum income and maximum income. So apparently it's a topic we are allowed to talk about, a maximum income. It's actually a word that I see appearing in the book. I can't remember which page, but you talked about a maximum income. How does it work, a maximum income?
Well, no, I didn't talk about maximum income. In the book, whether I can't remember where in the book, but I don't have the book with me at the moment, but in the book, we refer to the fact that much of the sentiment of injustice is provoked by the fact that you have individuals who earn sometimes billions in a way that is not very conducive to positive social outcomes, social welfare. You know, if you are a fund manager, a hedge fund manager who is in the business of shorting stocks, you may make a lot of money. You might do a bit for societies in terms of price discovery and this sort of stuff, but it's not something that creates a huge amount of social welfare. Nobody can dispute that. However, you have people who contribute a huge amount to social welfare and who are absolutely critical to a country's long-term growth trajectory. Teachers, professors, nurses, doctors, and these people, at least in many countries in Europe and certainly in France, where I live, earn a pittance, you know, a misery compared to the amount of education they received and the amount of studies and years of studies that they entered into. And we say in the book, it's not sustainable. You know, you cannot have a nurse or teacher who spent 5 years in higher education earning barely above the minimum income, minimum wage, and having next door a person who is an investor who earns sometimes $1 billion a year. It's not going to work. And if you earn $1 billion a year, yeah, you need to have an imposition rate, a tax rate, which is commensurate with the amount of money that you make. So that's the argument we make in the book, and you know, nobody can dispute that, even if you're a hardcore capitalist, and I am in many respects. You know, I think that the system can be tweaked, and there are many forms of capitalism, but you cannot have a sustainable capitalist system in which you have such strong imbalances that are just absurd from an economic point of view, looking at the long term. You know, if you look at the country long term, the two things that matters the most in terms of growth, economic growth over the long term, is the quality of the people and the quality of health. You know, so education and health. So you cannot not remunerate these people who provide you with health and education in a appalling manner.
There are a couple of topics within the economic reset, and one is digital money. Is there still room for tangible money, let's say within 10 years? Because some people claim that, especially the European banks, are aiming for a digital coin.
Well, Yeah, we discussed this a bit in the book. After the tech debacle that has happened over the past few weeks and the crash in the markets and the phenomenal crash in the crypto market, I think there is room for fiat currencies, absolutely. It's my own personal position, but I don't think that at the moment crypto money provides an alternative to fiat money. They are not a store of money or values. They are not a means of exchange. They are too volatile. They are not the right tool for doing that. And everything that's been happening over the past few weeks is a testimony to the fact that fiat money, the euro, the dollar, the renminbi, have a bright future ahead of them. And yeah, there might be some form of digital money managed by the central banks. It's happening in many countries around the world. But crypto money, the Bitcoin of this world, as far as I'm concerned, they are dead.
Yeah, but so when people claim,
a lot of enemies by saying that, but Topi.
When people claim that some institutions like European banks are aiming for a digital coin, there is also a hidden agenda that they claim that it's easier to track people, to see their expenditures, to see and to monitor their behaviors. That's also a fear behind that statement. So when I'm listening to you, it's not a concern for the near future, replacing tangible money for a digital currency. It's not realistic.
No, I don't think it's realistic because it doesn't work. We've seen it.
Yeah,
we've seen it. People who invested in crypto money lost almost everything over the past month or so. So they do not provide an effective alternative yet. Maybe they will in years from now, but at the moment they don't.
In the book, you also talk about the dilemma between globalism versus localism or nationalism in some parts. So could you define globalism? I know you actually define globalism in the book, but let's define it for our viewers and readers.
Well, we talk about globalization in the book rather than globalism. And globalization is a free movement of goods, of people, of services, of trade, of capital. And it's been dominating the global economy for decades now. It's been very effective at reducing extreme poverty in many countries around the world. In China, hundreds of millions of people were lifted out of poverty thanks to that. It's been very detrimental to some specific groups, particularly in rich countries, in Europe, in the US, hence the explosion of dissatisfaction vis-à-vis globalization. And at the moment, it's in retreat, but it's not dead. There is less of it, but we started from a very, very high level. And if you measure it in terms of trade, it's still quite consequential. It's still quite big. And because of the war with Russia, because of the frictions, very deep frictions with China, there is at the moment a retreat from the globalization as we knew it. Globalization was China and the West. It was a lot of energy coming from Russia to the West. So this is now put into question by the geopolitical frictions, but it's rather a change in terms of who is contributing to globalization. So there may be less from China, but more from Vietnam, or for countries from Southeast Asia. There might be some nearshoring. For example, in Europe, many garments that used to be produced in Asia are now being produced in the Maghreb, in Morocco, in Tunisia, in places which are closer to Europe. So it's a shortening of supply chains, and it's going to be a very different form of globalization, maybe less intense than in the past, but it won't disappear from the earth. It will still be a major contributor to global economic growth.
So, and what's the counterforce of globalization? Is that actually nationalism?
It's nationalism, I think. Nationalism is the antonym to globalization. There are many strong interests at the moment, particularly in the far right, to bring it to an end, to stop globalization, and to ensure that your narrow, restricted local interests prevail, but that that destroys value. You pay more for the goods that you buy. That's essentially what it means.
So you mean intrinsic value of a product? Not. I was thinking of human values. Community.
No. Okay, I was just about to talk about human values.
Oh,
I'm talking at the moment about economic value, because many people say I'm against globalization.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so there are many polls, many surveys conducted around the world with people, and you ask them, what do you think about globalization? It's bad. And they say, so you're against globalization, and are you still against globalization if it means that buying your hamburger or your shirt is going to be 20% more? And say, well, no, then I'm pro-globalization. So there is the economic dimension, which is critical. And then there is the human dimension of globalization, which is exactly what you just talked about. And it's different in the fact that particularly among far-right proponents, there is this willingness to retrench within your borders, to escape from evil foreign influence. You see it in the US, you see it in Europe, you see it in Russia, you see it all over the world. And it's incredibly destructive, it's incredibly dangerous, and it's very often the prelude to wars.
For whom is it destructive? Who is threatened by having a national identity or culture or
no, of course you can have a very strong national identity and still be in favor of having your fellow humans from Myanmar or Mali or Afghanistan coming to you.
Yeah,
nobody has ever said that you feel Dutch, I feel French, and yet I'm not going to close the door.
Yeah.
Of my fellow humans who want to come to my country.
Because most of the problem is here, they're presented as two exact opposites: a national identity, a community feeling, as opposed to a global identity with no borders. But you say they can go hand in hand. You can have a national identity and you can have a globalistic perspective and cooperation.
Of course you can. And I think maybe we'll address this later when we talk about all these conspiracies. But at the moment, there is this very strong, enduring tendency to think in binary terms. Mm-hmm. It's always black and white. There is nothing in between. We think without nuances. And in principle, nothing prevents you to having a strong national identity, to love your country, to love your culture, to love your language, and everything that pertains to where you are from, while being open to foreign influences and having a predisposition to like what the others do, which we do all the time. When you go, if I come to Amsterdam and go to an Indonesian restaurant, it's great, it's fun, it's good, it's something different. It's not, I don't see it as a threat. Well, many people who have strong nationalistic views close their minds to the possible influence of foreigners and don't want them to interfere in the course of their life, which is a very strong tendency that is developing around the world. And then it has an effect within your own country. If you're in Europe, you're historically Christian, and if you're nationalistic, you will tend to dislike the Muslims, or you will tend to dislike people who have a different color of skin. Or, well, I think it's bad.
Do you have good examples of countries who have a strong national identity and who contributes significantly to well, who have a global perspective as well?
Well, it's very different. It's very difficult to respond to your question because it's a personal attitude, and you know what I can see is that there are many countries which try to have an open mind to this phenomenon, and for which there is a backlash. That was the case in Germany when Chancellor Merkel decided to welcome 1 million refugees. You remember a few years back.
Wir schaffen das.
Sorry.
Her term was wir schaffen das. That was we can do it. Was her slogan?
Yeah, we can do it. And then there was a very strong backlash. And it's happening in many countries. I think there are many countries that are very hospitable to migrants. Successfully, I can tell because there is a backlash. There is a global backlash happening at the moment, which has to do with the fact that many countries around the world are retrenching around this narrow concept of national interest in a way that is detrimental to foreigners coming in, or to globalization. In this particular sense, globalization means freedom of traveling around, and you know, humans being capable of traveling from one country to the next. So to respond to your question, Europe is a good test case. EU. Now, if you are Dutch, you want to work tomorrow morning in Lisbon, you can go. That's it, and you'll be probably welcome with open arms.
Yeah, well, that's a nice isolated example. But let's have a look at Brexit, where lots of English said, well, we pay billions and billions of euros to Brussels, and the only thing we get is regulations, what we can and we cannot do. Whether it's true or not, it's still a sentiment that's present in many countries. I know in France as well, with Le Pen.
Of course it is. Absolutely. And the book was right in that respect, in pointing out that pandemics throughout history lead to this very same phenomenon. They force us to retrench, to reject foreign influence being perceived as a threat. So it's again a good example of pre-existing trends which have been exacerbated by the pandemic.
Yep. Well, that's the economic reset, well, a small part, because you really elaborate a lot about it. You talk about societal reset as well. And we also talked about it a little bit, redistribution of wealth. I think it's a great point. Are there any other societal resets which you talk about?
Well, that's the main one. You know, inequalities, we talk less about it today because of the war, because of climate disasters happening all over the world. But I think in the book we quote, if I'm not mistaken, we quote Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, saying that inequality is a defining feature of our time. Obama said it, so many people said it.
Yeah.
One of the most acute existential threats to our societal well-being. You know, we are divided by wealth in a way that a majority of people don't accept anymore. The entire social contract needs to be revisited everywhere, and that's a huge challenge. Yeah.
You're also talking about the new boundaries of the social contract. You propose a couple of things. Could you talk about a couple of proposals you make when it comes to a social contract? You say it's very difficult to define generic rules, but you do an effort in your book to talk about.
Well, we do because, you know, all these rules are culture dependent. You know, they differ so much from the country that you are considering, from the systems of belief, from the religion that they embrace, from the cultural rules, from the societal rules, etc. But we do try to identify something that need to be addressed. And one obvious one is paying fair taxes.
Yeah.
Through all over the world. Another one, which is also so obvious, is to increase the salaries of people who play a very fundamental social role, teachers, nurses, doctors, basically people in health and education. And we often take it for granted that this situation is such because we have no choice. It's bad luck, and yes, nurses earn a pittance in many countries, but that's how it is. And what can we do? Well, it's not bad luck; it's a policy choice. All these things are policy choices, and you have some countries which are much more effective than others at tackling the problem. So you said it earlier. You can decide that you put into place a tax system that is fairer. And there are many suggestions as to what it might be. You engage the citizens in an effort to identify the boundaries, the rules, inner working of the societies in which they'd like to work. You involve people, you involve everybody in the decision-making process. So these are very simple measures. We look at them, we look at some which are highly effective and yet so rare. One which we mentioned in the book is teaching empathy. I don't know whether it exists in the Netherlands. In the book, we quote the example of Finland and Sweden, in which empathy courses are part of the curriculum.
Yeah.
And it yields unbelievable results, which we're able to assess today economically because they've been in place for decades. So now there's some studies trying to measure the effect that it has on the crime rate, for example. And it's a phenomenal success. So why is it that you don't do it more? Yeah. Why is it that you don't have empathy courses all around the world?
In fact, let me interrupt you just for 1 second. This Florida governor, Marcos DeSantis, maybe you know his name.
Yes, of course.
And there is a big issue in Florida because many school books are banned because they discuss topics like racial theory, the critical
race
theory, and social emotional intelligence, which covers empathy as well. DeSantis says we shouldn't bother our kids with all these nonsense. We should teach them how to write and how to do mathematics, and let's not bother these kids with all these social emotional intelligence crap, I would say. But what you say,
it's madness to say that.
Yeah, apparently, because what you're saying is that it worked out really well in Scandinavian countries like Finland and Sweden. So you were elaborating about these positive results. Well, how do we see what kinds of results were generated?
Well, I need to look back at the articles which I used at that time. The book, we are incredibly careful about being data-driven and research accurate. So I recall a few articles. I had a discussion with an economist who specializes in these issues, called Dennis Noah, who is based in London. And well, I can't give you the exact numbers, but it has a measurable effect. It's positive. It's a net positive. If you teach empathy in school, you will have 20, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years later, positive measurable outcomes in terms of the number of people who go to jail, in terms of social harmony, in terms of attitude in the workplace, in terms of sexual assaults. It's incredibly broad. Mm-hmm. So it's a net positive. It's a net positive. So when you have something that works well somewhere, why don't you use it in other places?
Yeah. That's a good question. I think because education in the end is all about politics and in a lesser extent about science. I think politics always dominates education more than science does. That's my humble opinion.
But you're a teacher, so you know better than me.
The return of big government. In your chapter about societal issues, you talk about the return of big government. You quote Margaret Thatcher, who said there is no such thing as society. You touch upon neoliberalism, and you touch about the new role of the government, the important role of the government of harnessing the crisis. What do you mean by the return of the big government?
Well, I mean something very simple, which is that governments are going to play a more assertive role. The pandemic is one of the reasons why neoliberalism is coming to an end. You know, I think many people, including the hardcore capitalists and people who believe in the system, like myself, can sense that the era of extreme, unregulated capitalism has come to an end with the pandemic, because we all realize that governments has an essential role to play. You know, again, it's this silly binary thinking. If you are pro-business, you are anti-government. It's absurd. You can be both pro-business and pro-government. And the role of government is to regulate the way in which business operates, to take into account externalities, negative externalities, climate change, this sort of stuff, and ensure that we live in the most harmoniously possible society. So when the pandemic struck, we realized that you need governments, governments to provide health, to ensure that despite the many difficulties created by the virus, you can provide vaccines. You can, of course, many of these vaccines were developed by private companies, but with the help of governments, including in the US. You need to set rules so that we know how to take care of people who are sick. You need to manage the way in which hospitals run, etc. So I think this was a wake-up call, and taken as such by many economists, including liberal economists like myself, that governments has a very important role to play. And it goes beyond ensuring that the rules of the markets operate freely, or it's providing research, is sometimes putting into motion policies that favor specific outcomes. Climate change comes to mind, etc. So when we say returns of big government, it doesn't mean a static, obsessional government which is going to look at everything and prevent personal liberties to flourish. That's not what we mean. It's a bigger role than before.
Yeah. I would like to touch upon two more resets. The one is, I want to skip geopolitical resets. It's such a broad theme nowadays.
Yeah.
I know you touch upon China, the role of China and the US in your report, but there's so much going on. And in the end, I want to narrow it down to education. So the environmental reset, which is, I think, an important topic for educators as well to talk about. In the Netherlands, we have this crisis right now in which farmers are involved right now. Farmers are supposed to take measures in order to limit their output of harmful gases. I don't know the exact term for these gases. Stikstof, it's called in Dutch, stikstof, which is, I can't, anyway, lots of farmers have to close their farms because we have to meet certain standards and certain norms. And this is exactly the reason why so many people don't believe in let's say, Brussels, the European norms, because so many people are losing their incomes because they have to meet these European requirements. And it's really a really hot topic in the Netherlands. And you talk about an environmental reset as well. Could you elaborate a bit about this environmental reset and its consequences for the average citizens and maybe farmers as well?
Well, farmers, I can't, because I don't know anything about the situation you're describing in the Netherlands.
In general, then.
Yeah, well, in the book, we make the very simple case that COVID has been a wake-up call in terms of understanding the critical impact that the environment plays in our life. You may remember that in Europe, it started in Italy, which was in a harrowing situation, and northern Italy. And at that time, there were many articles, scientific articles, proving that there was a correlation, a high correlation between environmental degradation, particularly air pollution, and the occurrence of COVID-19. So during the pandemic and the lockdowns, more and more people realized the vital importance of having good air quality, for example, because it was one of the ways to prevent too many cases of COVID occurring. And it was broader than that. We realized the importance of well-being, and well-being has two components. There is individual well-being, of course, our health, mental health, physical health, degree of happiness, etc., and the well-being of the planet. You know, we need nature to be protected, and nature, by the way, contributes roughly, directly and indirectly, 50% of the global GDP. You know, through water services, through marshes, through the quality of the air we breathe, etc. So there was this wake-up call, and it took place at a time where there were rising concerns about climate change and extreme weather events becoming the norm. And now we see it all over the world. You know, every week there are extreme weather events becoming normal, happening on 5 continents. So that's a very key preoccupation. It's probably the foremost existential threat that we're facing. If you look at the IPCC report, which conclusions are incontrovertible because they are agreed upon by this host of scientists around the world, you understand that climate degradation and the environmental degradation in the broadest possible sense of the word have to be taken care of. So we have to take measures to restore biodiversity on the nature side and to reduce carbon emissions on the climate change side, if we don't want to be in a state of total, complete chaos in some decades from now, because the earth will become unhospitable.
You talk about
so regulation. Yeah, we need some regulations. You know, and I don't want to enter into the debate about what you just said, because I have no clue what it means, what it is, and what it means for farmers in the Netherlands. But we need to reduce drastically the amount of carbon that we're emitting around the world. That's what it is.
You talk about
that's a great reset from an environmental point of view.
Yeah.
And the action now, and the reset is permitted by the fact that this pandemic was an eye-opener publicly for most people around the world.
Yeah. Well, you talk about the Green Deal, the European Green Deal, which Frans Timmermans is occupied with organizing, costing about a trillion euros. I don't remember the exact number, but it's most of the time it's the citizens paying for it with taxes. And I know that a lot of people are complaining about the fact that it's the average Joe, the common people, who are paying for these plans. And of course, they are necessary, but they are longing for an equal distribution as well when it comes to addressing these problems.
Well, we talk about that in the book a lot, well, first of all, transitioning to a green economy can be a fantastic opportunity economically. You know, it's going to generate trillions in revenues, and many new jobs, etc. What's going to be very painful, and what you just alluded to, is the short-term cost of the transition, and short-term can last a few years. So the question is, how do you protect the interests of the people who are going to suffer the most? We saw it in France during the Gilets jaunes episode. You impose a small tax on diesel, and you trigger a wave of social unrest. So I think policymakers are incredibly attentive to this risk, and the way in which fiscal resources and incentives can protect the most vulnerable members of society and the people who are going to be hit directly by the decisions that are made to make the planet livable for the generations.
Because I know for a fact that our Prime Minister, Mark Rutte, prevented progressive tax laws because he was afraid that major companies would move their businesses to other countries if we would come with these kinds of tax laws. Of course, he has a point. So there's always these forces that make it really difficult, because of course we don't want the common Joe, the average Joe, the common citizens to pay for everything. On the other hand, we really appreciate big companies investing in our country. So how do you make a fair division without chasing away these big companies?
We address it in the book, but on the surface, it's a phenomenally complex issue. Mm-hmm. It's a problem of collective action. Finding a way to make everybody's actions consistent with each other and acceptable by all, and it's incredibly difficult because we talk about ourselves, but there is also an issue, a big issue of climate justice. We ask India, China, countries in Africa to pay for something for which they bear no responsibility, because they didn't emit any carbon, almost any carbon, over the past centuries, contrary to Europe and the Northern American continent. So it's a very, very complex issue, and what we say in the book is that it cannot be addressed unless you protect the income of the people who are going to be suffering directly because they're affected by it.
Yeah,
sure.
The last reset I'd like to address is the technological reset. We're not really talking about a reset because these technological developments have been going on since the Industrial Revolution, and even before. There has never been a reset, but I think we should approach it in a different manner. So let's talk about this technological reset.
Well, the reset, technology, we set it apart in the book, and the reset might take the form of the regulation that would be imposed upon the technologies that we're developing at an extremely fast pace at the moment. There is an explosion in terms of technological innovation, which is following an exponential path. And the truth is that we have very little understanding of how these technologies are going to impact us. Whether you look at AI, whether you look at bioengineering, all these extremely sophisticated new technologies are being invented, developed, put into application at a very fast pace. And the development exceeds by far the ability of most people like you and I to understand how they're going to impact everybody's life. We get a sense of what it means when we look at the surveillance system, which was put into place during the pandemic in many countries around the world. We started to be traced, to be tracked. There are countries in which you have cameras that follow your movements, that you have many invasive technologies trying to understand what every one of us does at a particular moment during the day and night. And that's a concern. I think the concern is being best understood in Europe, which is a continent so far that is putting into place the most stringent rules in terms of containing the impact that it might have on our lives. For example, facial recognition, these technologies are being monitored very, 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 very carefully, in contrast to what's happening in some other countries, like China, for example. But it's ongoing. We talk about the reset, we talk about regulation, we talk about trying to understand where these technologies might lead us, but it's ongoing, it's happening fast, as I just said, and it's going to unfold over many, many, many years. Hard to tell how we'll deal with that.
What you're saying in the book is it's inevitable for governments to track people if you want to harness a pandemic. So at some point, you need to be tracking your citizens in order to see outbreaks and to harness them as quickly as possible. Am I right?
Well, no, not quite. I think it's more nuanced in the book because, for example, we talk about in the book, it was, we wrote this chapter, I think in April 2020. So we're just talking about having these apps on our phones in which you upload your certificate if you fall ill, and which you then needed to. But for example, in Europe, I think we have no concern about this data being used for any other purpose. Are you concerned?
Well,
I am not because there are rules, and I am not concerned because there are so many activist groupings monitoring the way in which governments observe these rules, that if there were some problems, as it was the case, for example, in Singapore, when the police took, you may remember, into an investigation, and the police used data provided for your COVID app. Well, I'm confident that this couldn't happen in Europe. And if it were to happen, we would know about it the day after the incident. So we are lucky to be living in a continent in which our individual freedoms are incredibly well protected. For the moment, God knows what's going to happen in the next years, because it's incredibly difficult to monitor the way in which technologies are being used. Technologies are you cannot prevent technological innovation. Once it takes place, you use these technologies. What you can do is to regulate the way in which they're being used. And at the moment, I'm confident that it's properly done.
Yeah. Well, I find a funny thing is a couple of months ago, I interviewed Glenn Greenwald, and he is the journalist behind Edward Snowden. And of course, we talk about tracking and surveillance since the pandemic, but let's not forget that Edward Snowden uncovered the NSA practice of surveilling citizens nationwide. It's happening for decades, I suppose. And now, since the pandemic, we are surprised that the government has insights in our whereabouts, but they always have, I think. And now, because of the crisis, we are a bit more aware. But let's not pretend like the government.
But if you're more aware, you're also in a better position to protect yourself, at least in democratic regimes.
Yeah. Education. We talked about all these resets. How can I, as an educator, reset my education to prepare my students for the world that's coming and the world we're living in right now? In fact, does our education need a reset?
Wow. I should have prepared for the question. I find it impossible to respond for two reasons. First, I think educational systems are very dependent from the country in which they originate. So I have no idea how the Dutch education system operates. I know about my own education system. I know about Italy. I know about Britain, where I went to university. But that's it. My sentiment, again, there's a sentiment of a layman with no expertise whatsoever, is that in a world that is increasingly technological, I think it's fundamentally important to pay attention to our humanities. So to favor, educational disciplines like philosophy, like literature, like anything that allows you to better understand the world, instead of one segment of how the world operates, like through mathematics or physics or chemistry. What I'm important. So humanities, I think, is essential. Because I walk so much, I'm always struck that we don't take advantage of nature more. I can't understand why we are stuck in these classrooms instead of being able to be taught outside. And I know of a project in Canada called l'Université dans la Nature, University in Nature. And they made it a profession to educate adults and children by going outside. And when you're outside, you have all the disciplines of this world under your eyes. You look at a tree, you see biology, you see history, you see geography, you see physics, you see literature, you see poetry, everything. So why is it that we don't take children more outside for courses? Well, there may be legal reasons, there may be all sorts of reasons, but because it's something which is so fundamental for our own physical and mental health. It surprises me. And I ask this question to educators all the time. Why don't you go outside?
I can think of a reason, because we always want to quantify education. We always want to measure results. I know for a fact, because I have been in the system for 14 years. If you can't measure it, it's irrelevant for education. In the Netherlands, in America, even in Scandinavia, if you can't measure it, we're not going to do it. If you go outside and people feel nice, it's good for them. It's not what we're looking for. We want to see numbers, especially in the Netherlands. We work by numbers and measurements.
But can't you both? Can't you take children outside and then measure the impact it has on their?
Well, that's very difficult. How would you measure that?
I have no idea, because I don't know how the measurement system functions.
But if you have to measure, you
don't simply go outside. You give courses outside.
Yeah. Because it's really easy to measure the knowledge of mathematics or the English irregular verbs, let's say. But to measure the well-being of a student, its correlation to going outside, that's a really difficult thing. I think that's one of the reasons. But I think you're right. And I see initiatives in the world of schools going outside more and more. But I also see criticism from the field of educational science that we should focus on what matters most: teaching and education, and educating children the basic subjects like mathematics. But I agree. My last topic was conspiracies and myth. The most cited sentence concerning the Great Reset is you'll own nothing and be happy.
Never said, never written, totally false.
It's not in the book. It's not in the book. I did a Control F search or a Command F search. It doesn't appear. So who coined the term? Do you know?
No, I have no idea. I have no idea. Well, I'm sure it comes from conspiracists, because it was never said by either Klaus Schab or myself. We checked, so I'm sure that we could find out by spending a bit of money and trying to identify the source. But that's how conspiracy operate. You have a license to lie, and to place words in the mouths of the people you accuse, without incurring any cost, because lying is free. And that's what I find incredibly sad with all these conspiracies. I haven't read much about the book, conspiracies about the book, because I think it's a waste of time, and it's also depressing.
It's said about the book when we talk about conspiracies that this is especially written for the elites, and especially it's an elite club society that wants to rule the world with neglecting by neglecting the common citizens. That's another view of this book. How would you respond to that?
I would just respond by saying it's just absurd. Elitist view. A lot of conspiracy theories are based upon the observation that if you went to university, you belong to the elites, which is true. Going to university is a very elitist thing to do. It costs money, it costs time, it's years of your life that you invest into something which doesn't yield a tangible outcome. So you can be accused of having gone to university or of having educated yourself.
And the slogan of the elite leaders is "Let's build back better." That's their code word, because if you say that as a world leader, you're one of the guys.
Yeah.
Build back better. What does it mean, build back better?
Well, that's the assumption made by the book, that when things go very badly, you are incentivized to put into place policies, measures that are going to improve the situation. This is what the Great Reset is all about. And the fundamental argument made in the book is twofold. You need to make the world more equitable, inequalities, and more respectful of Mother Nature, the environment, climate change, environmental degradation. If you're against these two premises, it's up to you. It's fine. If you think the world is equal, it's perfectly fine from a social point of view. Okay, it's your point of view. I think it's absurd. It's not grounded in data, in observation, in research, but it's totally, you're right. If you think the same about climate change, it's all right as well. I think it's just absurd because the evidence is incontrovertible. But if you think that, like so many people at the moment in the US, in the MAGA sphere, that you shouldn't be addressing environmental policies because we are just fine with what's happening. Okay, it's your position. And I vehemently disagree with them. But what I dislike, of course, evidently, is this proliferation of crazy conspiracies that put into our mouths things that are not, that we never said.
How is the average citizen represented in the WEF? Because you have to agree, it has this elitist atmosphere with all these world leaders, CEOs, famous people. How do you make sure you represent the views of the common people as well?
Well, I cannot respond for the WEF. I'm not a WEF employee, but I've been to Davos and I was part of Davos, so I can partly respond with a great deal of caution. What the WEF did many years ago was to enlarge the pool of invitees by having activists, NGOs, people like Greta Thunberg participating in the summit, in the annual event. And then the criticism is the following. Yeah, but Greta is also part of the elites. That's what she does. She travels around.
If the book would have been written by Greta, the same book, it would have been such a different, how would you say? So many people wouldn't have complained about it because it would have been written by Greta, because many things are really sensible when we talk about climate, about injustice, equity. But it's coming from Klaus Schwab, it makes it elitist. If Greta would have written it, it would have been a different story. Nobody would have complained, I guess. but we will never know.
We will never know, as you say.
My last question. You refer to lots and lots of literature in the book. I think you did great research in motivating your statements by research. If you have a look at the long list of literature, which 3 books would you recommend to my viewers and readers to read in order to, well, understand this current world better?
Wow, that's a very tough question. I wish you'd asked it to me before we before we spoke. I need to think about it because I read a lot. That's my job. We have a macro newsletter, the monthly barometer. I read about at least a book a week and many articles. And
well, let me change the question. I know it was a tough one, but maybe
I can respond. If you doubt that climate change is real, I advise everybody to read the latest IPCC report, which it's not a book; it's a report. It's in the it's quoted in the biography of the Great Reset. Fundamental because again the results are incontrovertible, the conclusions are incontrovertible. So I would advise every person to read the IPCC report. For the rest, we address so many dimensions that it's hard for me to tell. There are so many great thinkers that I quote in the book, whom I respect. If it's about the surveillance economy, to be Shoshana Zuboff, The Surveillance Economy, fantastic book. The End of Power, it would be Moises Naim, The Revenge of Power, fantastic book. There are many people like them that are quoted in the book, which I think all of them wrote, profound, impactful books about what's happening in the world. And
let's narrow it down to your to you. Which book doesn't have to concern the pandemic, but which book changed your life after reading it?
It sounds absurd to say that, but every book which I read changed my life. I profoundly believe in the power of reading. Books are the meta disciplines by excellence. When you read a book, you understand something totally new, and it's a process of discovery. I reread a while ago this incredible book, which was so prescient, which made me realize that when you read a novel, you read everything. I don't know whether you heard about the book.
No.
Tony Robinson. It's a book that takes place in 2028. It's a climate fiction book. Everything that's happening at the moment is in the book. Okay. So if you read the book 4 years ago, it was published in, let me tell you when. I know 2020. I thought it was earlier than that. Well, the book is prescient. It's a novel. So I read a lot of novels because novels allow you to peer into, War and Peace to understand Europe at the moment. Tolstoy. You read Tolstoy, and you grasp immediately what's happening in Europe at the moment, and the war, particularly the war in Ukraine. So every book opens my eyes. I'm reading a book at the moment called Poverty Safari, written by a man whose name I forgot. It's bad. In England, who came out of poverty in extreme circumstances. Well, I've never been poor. This opens my eyes about what it means to be poor. And the process you go through when you live in poverty, socially, economically, psychologically, mentally, is very hard to understand, to comprehend. Well, this book opened my eyes about what it means and the judgment that you have on people who emerge out of poverty. So yeah, every book is great by itself.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that was actually you're the first one to answer this question like this. Most of the time, people come up with 3 titles, and you're saying every book changes my life. That's the best answer I have had until now. So,
what's your favorite book, if I may ask?
Excuse me?
What is your favorite book?
I really like the works of Harari, Homo Deus, Sapiens, and
Did you
21.
talk to him? Did you talk to him?
I've sent him an invitation a couple of times, but he's so busy. I think he's one of the most popular scientists alive today. So it's really difficult. But I write him a letter every year. So let's see what happens. But
every day.
No, every year. I mean,
but do it every day. Maybe it will increase your chance.
Yeah, so I really like his books, and I read a lot of literature about cognitive science. I like to read about how people read. One of my favorite scientists, whom I've interviewed twice, is Noam Chomsky, and I really like his view on politics and on the world. So that's really, well, I don't really have a preference. I really like your report as well. It opened my eyes, actually. So I would recommend people reading COVID-19, The Great Reset, because many people have an opinion. They talk about conspiracies, and they claim that we are going to own nothing and be happy, but nobody has read the book cover to cover. So before you have an opinion about The Great Reset, please start reading the book. And then you have to come to conclusions. That's my humble opinion. So, Thierry, I would like to thank you for your time, because we've been talking.
Thank you for asking me to speak with you.
Yeah, you're welcome. So I hope your Achilles heals very soon, and you can.
Thank you so much. I'll be able to travel to Amsterdam. I should have come last week to Rotterdam for speech, and of course I couldn't.
Oh, well, let me know when you come to Rotterdam, because
if I happen to be in Rotterdam, I will let you know, and it would be great to meet and go for coffee or drink. Great.
Let's do so. So recover soon. Thanks for your time again, and I hope to see you in Rotterdam.
Thank you. Timon, is it correct? I'm pronouncing well?
Timon, well done. Yeah.
Okay. All the very best. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye-bye. Thank you.